Finality Rocket Pulse, the Chicken Rotation, Thunderlord, and Lord of Wolves. If you've played Destiny's endgame in the past year, you've probably heard these names before. Chances are you probably even use these DPS options when raids come down to the wire and you need something dependable and effective to get you through a clear. I'm sure many of you have seen my rotation ranking videos or content involving endgame damage strategies before and wondered, where does this stuff come from? Of course, testing still needs to be done to actually compare and check options, but that process is actually pretty straightforward. What isn't is the intermediate step, determining what makes a strategy worth testing, and that's what we're covering today. My channel has always focused on teaching Destiny players how to fish instead of just handing out seafood, so to speak. Today's video will be a continuation of that philosophy. As I mentioned recently, the rest of my content plan is largely focused on the theory and mindset behind effective endgame play, content that will hopefully equip you with the tools to improve as a Destiny player on your own, and I hope that this video is a good start for those of you interested in damage crafting. Now, originally I was going to make an updated video where I go over every raid and dungeon boss and describe the best damage options to use on all of them for this current DLC, Renegades. Now, I was 90% through making the presentation when I realized I was essentially telling people to use the exact same damage strategy for like almost every boss in the game, so I scrapped the whole idea and opted for something more interesting instead. Instead of me telling you what is meta on every boss, which will become pretty obvious by the end of this video anyways, let's talk about how and why certain strategies become meta. The answer is actually pretty simple and it boils down to one word. Outliers. Now you might be thinking outliers. I mean, duh. If a gun is an outlier in damage, people are going to use it because it does more damage. Video over. Boom. Well, fortunately for us, Destiny's damage meta is a little bit more interesting than that, since endgame players value outliers in more categories than just sheer damage output, on top of the fact that sometimes outlier damage comes at a disproportionate cost. So, what are these categories? The first and most important category of outliers is global stackers. These include any strategy able to incorporate a wide-reaching damage boost on top of the standard buff-debuff surge stack. Now, there are three major subcategories of global stackers: exotic weapons, exotic armor, and ability effects. Now, most exotic weapons are just spiced up versions of legendaries with extra damage being self-contained and individually testable. I'm talking about multipliers like Whispers, Whispered Breathing, or quite literally exotic effects like Dragon's Breath and its Flame Spew. However, some exotic weapons apply some sort of loadout-wide or team-wide stacking effect, and these are the ones that are often sources of potentially meta damage strategies. In the current sandbox, that would include Darcy's legendary sniper buff, Gjallarhorn's legendary rocket buff, Ergo Sum's sword buff, Hierarchy of Needs bow buff, and Touch of Malice and Witherhoard's ability to buff certain other weapons. However, the most relevant example in this category has to be Parasite. Not only does Parasite have a strong damage profile when used as a swap DPS weapon, something we'll touch on later, but its Worm byproduct exotic effect provides a 15% damage boost to all non-power weapon damage, enough to offset its soft holster requirement and empower class-leading weapons like Rocket Pulses and Uncivil Discourse. The next subcategory of global stackers is exotic armor. This is probably the most diverse category of global stacker, since exotic armor can impact damage in many different ways. Some exotic armor boosts all weapon damage, like Sanguine Alchemy, while others boost only certain kinds of weapons, like in the case of Mask of Bacchus or Lucky Pants. In their attempts to retrofit older, less favored armor, Bungie has even experimented with only boosting a certain classification of damage, like in the case of the Path of Burning Steps. And of course, there's a whole family of exotics that boost ability damage, either through transforming how an ability works, increasing its uptime, or by flat out increasing the raw damage of an ability. There's plenty of exotics we could list here, but some recently relevant examples include Lucky Pants, Curse of the Falling Star, and Controverse Hold. Finally, the last subcategory of global stackers is ability effects. This one's probably the most obscure of the bunch we've discussed so far, mostly because there aren't really that many of them. Banner of War boosts sword damage by 20% for users and 10% for allies, and Transcendence technically increases your weapon damage by 5% while it's active, but the former requires you to give up Titan's best damage super, and the latter is more often taken for granted rather than something you should try to design your entire damage strategy around. However, there is one ability-based global stacker that is far more potent than the comparative scraps you get from Banner of War. I am of course referring to the recently reworked Mobius Quiver, which applies a whopping 2.5 times multiplier to any bow damage once its meter is full. Bit of an outlier compared to even some of the most potent stackers in the other categories here, but that's what we're looking for after all. Before we move on, I should also mention artifact mods, since they can push certain weapon families into being more meta-favored over others. For example, Sniper's Meditation has shown a spotlight on, well, snipers this season, and while others like the recently buffed Still Hunt and recently released refurbished A499 would still probably be just as viable without it, we've had plenty of examples in the past where a weapon only defined the endgame DPS meta with the help of a powerful globally stacking seasonal mod. Let's cover base damage profile next. Like we mentioned earlier, if something is overperforming in raw damage numbers, then it's obviously worth looking at for DPS meta considerations. But without testing literally every damage source in the game, how do you know what's doing the most unmodified baseline DPS? Well, that's what the boss damage spreadsheet is for. A lot of people use my spreadsheet's isolated damage source rankings without exploring any further, and while for most content that's probably good enough, it was never intended to be used that way. The sustained and swap tabs exist so that you can find base damage outliers, and with that information, use your own reasoning to figure out what might be worth combining and testing with the other factors in the sandbox, the ones we'll discuss in this video. To save you some time, I'll cover the highlights in today's base damage sandbox. For exotic weapons, looking over the sustain tab, we have Wolfsbane outperforming almost all other swords with solid total damage, Still Hunt with Celestial Nighthawk, and Legend of Acreus. Parasite also gets an honorable mention in the swap tab since when you don't have to manually reload the gun, its DPS in a rotation context goes up considerably. However, as we'll discuss further in the video, exotic weapons need to make a very strong case for themselves when it comes to base damage profile, since you can only take one of them, and right now, very few of them do. So, which legendary weapons are stealing the spotlight from exotics? Well, if you check the Archetypes tab in the endgame analysis sheet, the answer becomes apparent. As usual, rocket pulses still have excellent DPS and solid total damage for their ease of use, but Uncivil Discourse and crossbows are also extreme boss DPS standouts, especially when factoring in the global stackers they can be paired with. Then there's the matter of ability damage, which can also be pretty complicated to test and analyze without experience. Thankfully, unless an ability has extreme uptime and excellent damage, strategies tend to be built around weapons and supplemented by abilities and not the other way around. Of course, we've had exceptions like grapple melee, throwing hammer, controverse chunking, and different variations of grenade spam. For these cases, the abilities tab in the boss damage sheet can reveal what's worth exploring. Non-charged grenades all pretty much have the same throw rate, so all you need to do is look at the grenades that have the highest damage per use, accounting for stacking problems. The swap tab also contains downstream information about grenades and melees that have some damage potential, but to be honest, ability damage outliers are usually pretty obvious, since most melees and grenades are designed around add clear or utility and have very little potential as sustained damage options. When it comes to super damage, unless a weapon strategy requiring a specific super outperforms others to such a degree that it is worth compromising your super selection, read Mobius Quiver, the swap tab will also show which supers have the best mix of total damage and burst DPS. At this time, that tends to be the usual suspects, Cuirass, Nighthawk, and either Stargate Nova or a double snap Metiodoxia Needlestorm. I briefly mentioned controverse chunking just now. While chunking isn't intended, if it's in the game for a period of time, it can certainly cause something to become meta. We saw this with old Wolfpack chunking, and of course we had essentially a full season's worth of time with controverse recently. If you're not familiar, chunking is when a damage source does more damage to a boss's health bar than its visual damage output would imply. This is hard to test for on your own, and it's relatively rare that a damage source chunks significantly enough to change its meta viability, but if it does happen, you'll probably hear about it. The next category of outlier is probably the simplest one, super and ability generation. In an era of powerful 200 stat supers, it's easy to see why generating a second or maybe even third super during a damage phase might be appealing, especially if you don't need to compromise much on your damage strategy in order to do so. If you want to understand how active super generation works, I'll give you the basics. On top of the passive super generation you get over time, dealing and receiving damage in Destiny gives you varying amounts of super, scaling with the damage quantity in question. However, each individual damage instance you see on your screen has its own cap on how much super it can give you. That means that a sniper shot dealing 5,000 damage will give the same amount of super as one dealing 2,500 if the instance cap for snipers is 2,000. This cap varies for different outgoing damage types, but in order to not overcomplicate things, I'll give you the gist of it. The best super generators tend to be weapons with high hit counts, since every separate damage number counts, including weapons with multiple instances per shot. Think Excalibur or grenade launchers. Lower RPM weapon classes tend to also have higher caps to balance things out, so any weapon that breaks this rule by having a high number of damage instances for its class will tend to have high super generation potential. Primaries are also favored in this system over specials and heavies, and so unsurprisingly, the super generation outliers in the current sandbox include Finality's Augur, class-leading Lucky Pants and Peacekeepers options, rocket pulses, and fusion rifles, which are all logical candidates given the conditions I just listed. I also mentioned ability generation, but that tends to be a lot more niche. Whereas super generation is a universal mechanic based on damage dealt, and damage supers tend to be universally good, the same can't really be said for typical abilities. When ability generation outliers come to mind in Destiny, we tend to think of things like old Starfire grenade spam, or potentially newer grenade spam variants using sandbox elements like the Sage Protector set or Attrition Orbs. I don't know, it's pretty hard to beat the fact that Navigator gives a consistent 100% refund on one of the most multiplier-friendly ability damage options in the game's history, so a lot of other ability generation options look a lot less appealing in context. It's helpful to know that there are sandbox elements that can create ability spam engines if needed in the future. Look no further than Apotheosis Veil and Song of Flame, paired with Wishful Vengeance Fleshed Storm not so long ago. But these tend to be very specific combos that of course rely on some base damage outlier being worth spamming to begin with. Since in today's sandbox, there aren't really any abilities that are good enough in their unmodified state to be meta contenders even with maximum uptime. The final outlier type we're going to talk about might be the most underappreciated of them all. Ease of use or usability comes in a variety of shapes and sizes when it comes to Destiny DPS. A damage strategy might be a base damage outlier with good global stacking compatibility and super generation, but it could still be unrealistic as a meta pick for a number of reasons. Let's go over some of the most common ones. First is a precision requirement, usually a result of a weapon having a high crit multiplier. For strategies like these, the need for divinity can make them mathematically or strategically less viable, or for some bosses like Zoetic Lockset, completely infeasible due to an incompatibility with precision damage. On other bosses, projectile travel time can also become a problem. Rockets are the biggest victim of this issue. If a boss is slender and highly mobile, any weapons that are relatively slow can run into an accuracy problem. Speaking of rockets, some bosses require damage to take place in such a confined area or in such close proximity to the player that explosive weapons like rockets and GLs can become less consistent due to self-damage issues. Range can also be a problem against plenty of bosses. You aren't going to use shotguns and swords on Sanctified Mind, for example. When people think about usability, this is another common one, execution complexity, like Thunderlord compared to a swap rotation. And finally, two more factors, fireteam scalability and loadout flexibility. If a strategy requires some sort of kill stacking or DOT stacking, then adding more players into the mix will naturally make things more complicated if people need to compete for stacks of any kind. On top of this, some damage sources literally do not scale proportionally if more than one person is using them too. As for loadout flexibility, this one's also pretty obvious. If a damage strategy requires you to be on a suboptimal subclass, class, or other piece of equipment, that might also cut into its usability. Let's take our new knowledge of outliers and apply it to 4 of today's meta contenders to see exactly how they ended up where they are. Starting with Parasite Rocket Pulse. If we look at its global stacker, Worm byproduct 15% to all weapons that are not in your heavy slot, pretty strong. Base damage profile, Rocket Pulses are great, and of course Parasite swap DPS is very high like we mentioned. Super generation, Rocket Pulses in general have pretty good super generation, and then ease of use, you can basically use Parasite Rocket Pulse on any class, on any subclass really, so pretty flexible there. And then downside, there is a small downside to Parasite. If you can't do the self damage to activate Worm byproduct, then you're going to lose out on some of your damage here. And of course, if a boss is very far away from you, then even hitting the Parasite to begin with is probably not very feasible. So you might want to look at something else. Speaking of an alternative, we have Finality Rocket Pulse. Now, unfortunately, no global stacker here, which is basically why Finality Rocket Pulse is the weakest in terms of raw DPS out of these 4 options here, as well as compared to previous meta picks. It would be relatively, the consistency pick, not necessarily the highest DPS, but base damage profile, again, Rocket Pulses already pretty solid start. Super generation, Finality plus Rocket Pulses, excellent super gen, probably the best on this entire list here. Ease of use, you have no precision requirement, which is nice. Any range, unlike Parasite, which kind of requires a melee-ish range boss. And then, of course, you have class flexibility, just like Parasite, can be used on pretty much anything. And then downside is you have a lack of burst in case a boss favors kind of burst DPS toward the end or beginning of the phase. And then the DPS is, again, not mind-blowing compared to some of the other options here. Next, we have Uncivil Discourse, global stacker, of course, Lucky Pants, very famous global stacker there, very, very potent. Especially with a special and not a primary hand cannon. We have base damage profile. Uncivil Discourse is just going to be a higher base damage profile than pretty much every other hand cannon that we've ever had in this game that scales with Lucky Pants fully. So that's why Uncivil Discourse is just a step above here when it comes to strong base damage profile outliers. And then you have ease of use. Unlike the others here, you do have to be on Hunter, so you can't be on just any class. But fortunately, you can kind of have any heavy that you want and any exotic weapon that you want because Uncivil is the main source of damage here, and it's a special weapon, and it's a legendary, right? So pretty flexible in that regard. And then the downside here is there is a precision requirement, which we didn't see on the other 2 here. So if a boss doesn't have an accessible crit, like a Wyvern or something, you would need a div. And if you don't have a div, there is some kind of execution error there. There's room for error, right? So there's a precision requirement, and of course, the class requirement. Like we mentioned, you do have to be on Hunter. And then finally, a good shout, which is, of course, the envious proccing, like Witherhoard Trace, or you can use the Heirloom. There's a bunch of different options. With Mobius Quiver and the new Vanguard Bow, a good shout. The crossbow. Global stacker here is going to be Mobius Quiver. Very, very potent, just like Lucky Pants. Boosts a specific weapon type by a lot, and it stacks with everything. So again, that's an outlier. Base damage profile, crossbow swap DPS, like we've talked about in previous videos when we're discussing DPS. again, pretty strong outlier compared to a lot of other stuff in the sandbox. I've also updated the swap tab in my DPS spreadsheet to include Mobius Quiver, and you can see just how much of a swap DPS outlier crossbows can be when you pair them with this global stacker. And then for super generation, not great if you've seen anyone use this strategy. You have your super active while you're shooting it and doing a lot of damage, so you're not even gaining super. And then when you're out of it, yeah, the super generation is not great. Ease of use, I would say, yeah, there's nothing particularly crazy here. This is definitely the most restrictive out of all of the meta loadouts that we've talked about so far, so not going to really put anything there. And then downside is envious DOT stacking. You can circumvent this using stuff like Heirloom and having people be on different DOT options, but obviously you can't have more than one Wither Horde. You can't have more than one area denial, stuff like that. And then, of course, the loadout is pretty restrictive compared to pretty much everything else here. So with that in mind, I want to cover another approach here, and that's going to be counterexamples. So another interesting approach to understanding why and how things become meta is by looking at some counterexamples. Now, let's look at 3 damage strategies that didn't make the cut in today's sandbox, and let's examine the reasons why they're not meta using our outlier framework. So first, we have back-risk rocket or just rocket-focused strategies in general. Now, the global stacker here is Light Shift. Light Shift is very strong. It's like a 45% plus global stacking buff that stacks with everything, which is really, really strong, right? Really, really strong. So off the rip, base damage, pretty good, right? Base damage profile, it's rockets. Now, rockets have been meta in the past in D2. We know they have strong swap DPS. So decent burst damage, not standout though. Surprisingly, DPS is not that standout compared to some of the other options that we have. And the total damage is not great. It's not great. On top of that, you do have to take bad supers with Backrus Rocket because you have to be on Hunter, first of all, and you have to take an Arc or a Stasis super, none of which are really particularly that good for damage. So not looking too great. And then you have super or ability generation. Now, rockets with Volt Packs, they give decent super generation, but nothing too crazy, not on the same level as like Rocket Pulses and Finality, so nothing too crazy. And then ease of use, unfortunately, Song of Flame / Sage Protector requirement. So something about Light Shift, right? Rocket-focused strategies without Light Shift, DPS, pretty poor compared to the stuff that's considered meta these days, even the consistency-focused strategies. So you do need that extra global stacker to make them stand out. And with that extra global stacker, you have a much stricter requirement, especially in fire teams, right? So the way Backrus works is you either need kills or you need something that gives you chunk class energy while Light Shift is active. Kills are pretty unreasonable given how many kills you need to stack up your Light Shift across a full fire team, especially in fire teams of 6 instead of 3. And then, so if you're going to go for that chunk, you need Song of Flame, which is, again, -1 Warlock, strong damage super or well on your team, or you need Sage Protector, which realistically, I think is not necessarily realistic, given that you need to do like, caster sword damage or something. It just makes it a lot more annoying, right? So that's one reason why Backrus Rocket, or even just rocket-focused strategies in general, are not necessarily meta. Of course, you also do need a galley, but I don't really count that as too much of a restriction, right? Next, you have non-grapple melee strategies. Global stackers, you do have stuff like Triton, Worm God, Syntho, but a lot of the melee strategies that are not grapple, they just lose out on 65% damage because of no 200 grenade access. The fact that grapple melee stacks with both the grenade and the melee stat means that anything that doesn't do that is just missing out on a free 65% multiplier, right? Which is pretty crazy. And then base damage profile, unfortunately, grapple melee has pretty high base damage compared to other melee options. If you go ahead and look in the abilities tab, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Base damage, there are some melees that have pretty high base damage, but nothing that scales or stacks with effects as much as grapple melee does. And it's certainly not anything that's as spammable, right? So base damage profile is just going to be worse than grapple melee. And a lot of the melee strategies like Throwing Hammer, for example, they just have worse DPS than even weapons as well, right? Without the requirements that something like Throwing Hammer might have, which is like Roaring Flame stacks, etc. And then super / ability generation, not really relevant. Generally, when you're doing some sort of melee strategy, you're just focusing on the melee, right? Maybe if you're on, on Hunter, you could do like a Nighthawk into a grapple melee swap. But, for the most part, you're not really looking to farm up a super, so not super relevant. And then ease of use, compared to just, Finality Rocket Pulse, for example, you have the stack gathering requirement for almost all melee strategies. And then you have also a surrounded requirement if you're using anything related to Syntho biotic enhancements, right? So unfortunately, definitely a lot more restrictive and kind of why you don't see melee strategies as being super meta in some cases. Now, right, there's other cases like, solo content, challenge content where this might come into play, and we'll discuss that later. But for the most part, this is why these strategies, especially non-grapple strategies, are not necessarily meta. And finally, the last category of counterexample we're going to cover here is going to be mainstream exotics. So I'm thinking about stuff like Queenbreaker, Whisper, Thunderlord, your D2 classics, your consistency classics. So why might these not be considered meta under this outlier framework? So global stacker, no global stacker, Nothing that really, provides an additional bonus to other weapons or anything like that from any of these weapons. Base damage profile is actually worse than equivalent legendaries. For example, Whisper versus A499, Queenbreaker versus A499, Thunderlord versus just like Rocket Pulses. You have Super Generation, which Queenbreaker and Whisper have basically none of. Thunderlord has decent Super Generation, but even there, it loses to stuff like Rocket Pulses or Peacekeepers, Lucky Pants, etc. And then for ease of use, great ease of use. That's why people use these weapons, right? Queenbreaker, Whisper, Thunderlord, they're pretty easy to use, right? But there are higher DPS alternatives with similar usability and similar quality of life. Maybe a small learning curve, but in terms of like when you would use them and how convenient it is to use them, something like Finality Rocket Pulse, you can basically use it on any boss, no matter what the boss's shape is, how far the boss is from you. And then of course, Thunderlord kind of benefits from like a div, whereas Finality Rocket Pulse, whether you have a div or not, it's pretty easy to get pretty much close to max damage, right? So in terms of quality of life, pretty similar. So with that in mind, I want to give you guys like a bit of a visualization when it comes to this concept, right? So first of all, when people say meta, they can mean different things. For our purposes, we're going to assume that it means the strategy that players have agreed upon and gravitate towards in a specific endgame context. Now notice how I didn't say the objective best possible options available. Things fall in and out of favor depending on factors that don't even necessarily relate to the quality of the strategy. And endgame Destiny has plenty of different environments where one strategy might go from a must pick to completely unusable. So if we imagine all the potential meta strategies on a DPS versus usability graph, there's always a vertical threshold that rises and falls to meet the occasion. So for example, on a day one, the threshold is usually not optimal, but clearable, perhaps near the red line here. So on the other hand, in a speedrun or challenge, where damage is tighter, more optimized, the threshold might be as much damage as possible without significantly compromising mechanics, which might be somewhere higher near like the green line instead. And of course, with a visualization like this, you can clearly see why options like Finality Rocket Pulse and for a time, Controverse Chunking took over the game's meta, as well as why Uncivil and A499 were disabled for the Equilibrium race. As time goes on, this threshold slowly rises as more and more damage options get power crept, the meta evolves, and damage checks become tighter. Now, to be honest, I'm interested to see how Bungie gets their way out of this jam, even with the upcoming Raid and Dungeon weapon retrofits. I mean, without nerfing like 4 different strategies that have pervaded different parts of the sandbox, none of the old weapons stand a chance against the archetype and ability power creep we've experienced over the past 2 seasons, but that's a subject for another video. So let's move on to the conclusion. So how do you find new meta options? Well, let's summarize. First, remember to look for outliers. The 4 major categories we discussed were global stackers, base damage profile, super and ability generation, and ease of use, with artifact mods getting an honorable mention. Now, realistically, almost all of the sandbox has been explored, so I'm usually looking to monitor changes to existing options to see if they benchmark well after a patch. For example, if a new weapon archetype releases, or a current weapon archetype is buffed or nerfed, or some sort of ability or exotic is reworked, and the previous state of such a damage component already had potential, then it might be worth a look. For example, when the 9.5.0 Winter's Wrath buffs were announced, the numbers put forward were ridiculously high. I mean, like a 210% buff on the biggest damage component of the super sounds insane. But I knew that Winter's Wrath in its baseline state was so weak that it still wouldn't be enough to make it a meta contender, and it isn't. So keeping your finger on the pulse of every major damage marker and theorizing how upcoming changes might push something into relevance is how DPS metas are developed in most cases, with the exception of brand new damage sources being released. Now after that, it's simply a balancing act between DPS and usability. Thankfully, outside of very specialized damage options, often with range limitations or kill-hungry engines, this usually isn't a concern. So usually, the only major concern is keeping up with DPS and total damage requirements. We're definitely in an interesting era of Destiny when it comes to DPS. The sandbox is very diverse, but there are definitely a few runaway options that are unlikely to be dethroned anytime soon. Perhaps there will be more contention if there's a major sandbox adjustment patch closer to Shadow and Order, but for now, enjoy melting bosses in one-hand cannon mag, and I hope this information was at least academically useful to you.